It's the Kyle Hyman Show on Redeemer Radio.
This is Kyle Hyman, and joining us to talk about discernment, vocation, and some practical tips, do's and don'ts, is Father George Elliott. Thanks for being here, Father George.
Thank you for having me, Kyle.
So to start off, I am going to take the bait. I can't resist. In your bio, it says that you enjoy such things as the early church, evangelization, and which cartoon character captures your personality the best. So, which cartoon character captures your personality the best?
I prefer identifying other people's personalities. However, my friends tell me I'm a lot like Scrappy-Doo.
Scrappy-Doo, okay.
Referred to as Scrappy, yes, yeah. Go charging it. Let me at him, Be
Was
not
he
afraid.
Scooby-Doo's nephew?
Yes,
okay.
That's right.
Interesting. So,
yes.
So Scooby's got a brother or sister somewhere that had a puppy named Scrappy.
Yes, apparently, who is obviously my parent. Yes.
Good, your alter ego.
Yes.
Well, speaking of vocations, could you tell us a little bit about your process of discerning your vocation?
Yes. Yeah. So for me, I grew up in a Catholic household, and we would always go to Mass on Sunday. However, I was not one of these super Catholics by any means. Just kind of lived the normal American parish life, which sadly was not terribly inspiring to me. And so by the time I was in high school, I just wasn't really that interested in my faith. I don't know that I had really rejected God's existence. I just didn't know if he existed and if the Catholic Church was the true church. And I figured, you know what, I'll just deal with this when I'm 80 years old and go to confession or whatever and get in the door as it's closing.
Uh-huh.
But what happened is I had a cousin who was just a year older than me who died in a car wreck. And that was a major life-changing experience that drove me to begin asking big questions. And one of those was, well, does God exist? Yes or no? And if he does, then this is really worth living. And if he doesn't, then I should stop wasting time sitting in Mass for an hour every Sunday. Mm-hmm. And thanks be to God, I had a good priest and a good layman, a father of a family, move into my hometown right at about the same time. And I just really started asking questions to them, and I was definitely one of those punk teenage kids who asked the questions in the meanest way possible. And both of them were just very, very, very patient with me and answered my questions. They were very well read, very intelligent men, and so they could answer every single one of my questions. And at the same time, my parish got started with a 24/7 adoration chapel, and my mom was badgered into signing up for a family holy hour, but my dad was working out of town during the week, and my sister had left for college, and my mom didn't want to go, and so she just sent me, and so I spent a lot of time sitting in front of the Blessed Sacrament. At first, daydreaming, but really I got to the point where, I thought, oh my goodness, this is true, then that's really our Lord. I should start praying, and so it really grew in my devotion to the Blessed Sacrament and my faith in the Eucharist. Then as I finished high school, I went to college at the Air Force Academy, and I had known at the time that I was probably called to the priesthood, but I just didn't want to do it. And it was while I was at the Air Force Academy that they really encouraged, they would talk about duty and service and answering the call and all of these different things. And it was actually kind of their formation that drove me to leave the Air Force Academy and enter the seminary, because I thought to myself, if I'm here telling myself that I'm answering the call, but I'm actually called to the priesthood, I'm just lying to myself. So I need to, go ahead and enter, and I entered the seminary. And to tell you the truth, at the time, I had never encountered a religious brother or priest that was really joyful in their vocation, that loved their vocation, and that was really an inspiring person. And so I just went to what I had always known, and that was the diocese, a diocesan priest. And so I entered the seminary for the Diocese of Tyler. And while I was in the seminary, I began to encounter some of these really good religious brothers and priests. And I thought, wow, that's actually a really beautiful vocation. And as I write in the book, it's a higher vocation than diocesan priesthood. It takes up all of the vows. So I said, well, I'm attracted to this. This is a higher vocation. I should definitely look into this. And I started the discernment process for religious life. It was at that time that the book kind of arose in my mind. I started looking for practical ways to discern a vocation, and I really had a hard time finding them in English. I luckily I had a chance to study a few different languages and really get into theology and philosophy and all of those things while I was in the seminary. And so I could engage some of these higher level books. But at that time, I just couldn't find anything that was practical and, that an average person could read. And so it kind of stuck in my mind at that moment that, well, the church seems to need one of these books. And my bishop was very patient with me during that time. I made a good discernment, and it just became clear that I was, in fact, called to be a diocesan priest. So I stayed in the seminary and was ordained a priest for the Diocese of Tyler, Texas.
So all of this, the process of discernment in these different steps, first discerning that you were called to be a priest, even if you were hesitant to act on that, and then later discerning what form of priesthood that would take. What was your process for that? Were you asking questions of God, or were you just sitting there and all of a sudden it popped in your head like, oh, I'm supposed to be a priest? What was your process of discernment?
Yeah, there were a few things that kind of identified it when I was in high school that, I recognized, I have a strong faith and a strong love for the Blessed Sacrament, for the Sacrament of Confession. I don't despise prayer or anything of the sort. I didn't have just overwhelming struggles with purity, and I had a sincere desire to love other people in the greatest of ways, namely to do whatever I could to bring them salvation. And so kind of identifying all of those things, those were all definitely signs, none of them were definitive, but it was kind of as I began to open up more to the idea of celibacy, actually, that the step toward the priesthood became absolutely clear. They talk about that really before discerning priesthood, you should discern an openness to celibacy. That, if you think you're called to the priesthood, but you don't think you're called to celibacy, then, you're not called to the priesthood, at least not in the Roman rite. And it was studying more of the theology of the body that opened me up to this idea of having that undivided heart and, living a celibate vocation for the sake of the kingdom of God, that then completely just, flipped the switch in my mind of, oh, well, of course I'm called to the priesthood. And then from there, it was more of a recognition. I don't think I was really aware of how good and how beautiful religious life is at that first decision point, and it was at that second decision point when I was discerning while in the seminary that I really went through that discernment process for religious life.
We're talking with Father George Elliott, who wrote the book Discernment, Do's and Don'ts, a practical guide to vocational discernment. And let's maybe start with the don'ts. What do you think is either the biggest misconception about discernment or the biggest mistake that people make while discerning?
Danger is when you're doing it for somebody else. So when you're making vocational choices, whether because you're getting married to this person, or you're entering the seminary, or you're entering religious life, or you're doing any of those things because someone else wants you to. Obviously, other people's advice is very important. However, God will communicate His vocation for you to you, and you're doing it for God, not for your mom or your dad or your friends or whoever it may be.
Right. What about some of the do's? What are some things that you would suggest that people do to figure out what God's calling them to?
On a really broad level, I think there are three main points. First off, really focus on holiness, on developing a real prayer life, having that relationship with God just for the sake of the relationship with God. I read in the book that God doesn't like telemarketers. I find oftentimes people will approach discernment as, or will approach prayer as really just a tool for discernment. Prayer is something that we should desire and should have in our lives, regardless of whether or not we're discerning. So first off, that holiness, prayer and growth in virtue. Second, really knowing and understanding, just like you would kind of balk at the idea of someone trying to discern marriage without getting to know people of the opposite sex. So also, it just doesn't make sense for us to try and discern any vocation without really knowing the concretes of that life and of that particular vocation. And so really making sure you understand the other vocations and then understand yourself. And one of the biggest tools for understanding ourselves is to speak with somebody, some good Catholic who we trust, who's well-formed. It could be a priest, it could be a youth minister, it could be a parent, a friend, a relative, somebody who is well formed in the Catholic faith and who really has our best interest in mind to help us just understand what's going on within us. It's not easy to understand how God is speaking to us. And then the last step is to act. Each vocation has a kind of graduality to it. For discerning marriage, it's, you go on a first date, and then you go on a second date, and then, you enter into courtship, and then you enter into engagement, and then you get married. There are multiple steps. So also with the seminary, you talk to the vocations director, you enter into the seminary, you've got your first few years of philosophy, and then you have theology, and then you're ordained a deacon and then a priest. For religious life, it's the same thing. You enter in, there's a time of postulancy, of temporary vows, and then all the way into solemnly professed. And so just really, each of those steps, making sure that when we are at a point in which we feel or we are sufficiently certain that this is the next step that God is calling us to make sure and act and not just sit in a kind of locked up state, refusing to move forward in that call.
Yeah. Do you think that young people today are having a more difficult time with discernment, or at least putting it off longer and kind of stretching out, like just not being decisive maybe?
I think in general there is a kind of prolonged adolescence that's happening in society. I think that it's across the board, and that is contributing a little bit to a later decision point for a lot of young people. I don't necessarily know that they're having a harder time doing the discernment, because I think there is one really good thing that's happening right now, and that is that many young people understand that discernment is an important thing and that God has created them for a vocation, and they desire to pursue that. And so there's a real active pursuit of a vocation, which is a really good and beautiful thing. However, I do think that the kind of societal whole of this prolonged adolescence does affect the process a bit.
Well, and you don't want to rush into something at the same time, so it's good to do your due diligence with discernment. And this book is going to be a great resource for anybody that's in discernment, and obviously it'd be such a good thing for youth groups, young adult groups to look at and study and help prepare people to think about not just a career, not just a job, but a vocation, and find out what God's calling you to. Where should we send people to get the book?
Best place to pick it up on is Amazon.com, or you can go to 10books.com.
All right, again, it's called Discernment Do's and Don'ts, a practical guide to vocational discernment by Father George Elliott. And also, I was hoping really quickly, could you share a little bit about the work that you are doing with CAST?
Yes, CAST Media is a Catholic media organization based out of Austin, Texas, that does film. It does kind of the documentary type films. It does catechesis videos. It also helps different organizations with their social media plan and communications plan on an organizational level, just trying to really spread the gospel on digital platforms.
All right, and people can check that out at CatholicCastMedia.com. And again, check out the book, Discernment Do's and Don'ts. Thank you so much, Father George Elliott, for sharing a little bit about vocations with us today.
Thank you, Kyle. It's been a pleasure.